We're going to send you into the wind tunnel again, okay? Jonathan Edwards was one of the most respected preachers in his day. He attended Yale at age 13. That's pretty amazing that he would do that at that age. And later became the president of Princeton. He and his wife Sarah had 11 children. Every night, Pastor Edwards spent an hour talking with his family and then praying a blessing over his child. So that tells you how important his family was to him. They passed on a godly legacy. It was the story of their lives. Well, A.E. Winship, an American educator, decided to trace the descendants of the Edwards family, almost 150 years after Jonathan's death. His findings were remarkable, especially when you compare them to another man from the same period named Max Jukes. Jonathan Edwards' legacy includes, and I think some of these numbers are rounded, 1 U.S. vice president, 1 dean of a law school, 1 dean of a medical school, 3 U.S. senators, 3 governors, 3 mayors, 13 college presidents, 30 judges, 60 doctors, 65 professors, 75 military officers, 80 public office holders, 100 lawyers, 100 preachers, and 285 college graduates. Edwards was a godly man, and he was smart, he was hardworking, and he lived a very moral life. Besides that, Winship says much of the capacity and talent and intensity and character of the more than 1,400 Edwards descendants is due to Mrs. Edwards. Jonathan and Sarah Edwards left a legacy that persisted for generations. Well, the same really could be said of Max Jukes, only his had a far different impact. The family trees of 42 men in the New York prison system were traced back to him. Jukes' descendants included 7 murderers, 60 thieves, 190 prostitutes, 150 other convicts, 310 paupers, 400 alcoholics, and of the 1,200 descendants studied, 1/4, or 300, died prematurely. These 2 legacies are examples of what's called the 5-generation rule. How a parent raises their child, the love they give, the values that they demonstrate and teach, the emotional environment they provide, the education that's available, all these things influence their children for at least 4 generations afterwards, for good or not so good. As I shared with you recently, there's strong biblical and neurological evidence in the chemical makeup of your genes that certain traits and tendencies of your life get passed on. It actually genetically forms in you. And so it shouldn't surprise us that God says in Deuteronomy 5:9, I hold parents responsible for any sins they pass on to their children, to the 3rd, and yes, even to the 4th generation. So God knew all about the impact of our legacy long before the researchers figured it out in our biology or our environment. You know, God knows a lot more than science, and science is always catching up with him. What we're talking about in this series is how to make better decisions and live with fewer regrets. We're learning how to ask 5 questions that lead to better outcomes and the consequences that we might hope for rather than choices we end up regretting. So last week we looked at the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself? Really? So you need to be rigorously honest with yourself and ask why you're selling yourself on a decision. If you're not truthful with yourself, you might talk yourself into something that you later regret. But today we have a different question in mind. This question centers around what story do you want told about your life? Because our personal decisions impact other people. Our story impacts how their story turns out. So we're going to be talking about the legacy question. What story do you want to tell? When Winston Churchill was asked what will your legacy and the generations that follow you say about you? Churchill answered back, he says, history will be kind to me because I intend to write it myself. You see, that's exactly what we're all doing. You're writing a history of your life that speaks to those around you and who will come after you. How do you want the people to remember you after you're gone? What do you want your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids and your friends and people who knew you to say about you? What kind of impact do you want to have? How loudly will your life in Christ speak long after you've lived? You see, every decision that you and I make, especially the major decisions, become part of the story, the history that we are writing with our lives. That's because our decisions, particularly the significant decisions, have an outcome, a consequence, a result. They may be good consequences or bad. Decisions are desirable or undesirable, expected or maybe unexpected. Whatever the case, the outcome becomes a permanent part of your story. So let's talk about circumstances and consequences. You know, circumstances are things that you have no control over, or at least very little. You have no control over the family you were born in or grew up in. You have no control over many things that happen in life. Things that maybe you are powerless to do anything about. Some things that you have faced are the result of forces beyond you and which you couldn't change. But consequences are pretty much everything else that happens to us in life. Consequences are the result of the choices that you make. James Reeves says, I have come to believe that life is 10% circumstances and 90% consequences. So that really should give you some hope, because that means you can influence the consequences, or at least how you react to your circumstances. How you choose to react regardless of your circumstances is what writes the story of your life. Your choices bring with them consequences. You may have heard it said, we make our choices and then our choices make us. Or another way to say it is, our lives are the sum total of the choices that we make. And this is the way Paul puts it. He says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For what a man sows, that he will reap. So imagine your life as a highway of life circumstances. And you're on this highway. All along the way, you're faced with choices. And as you make these choices in the midst of your circumstances, you're planting seeds that will grow a harvest in your life and in the lives of the people that you're around. Your choices are going to go in one of two directions. If you choose to see the circumstances of your life as an excuse for how you react, maybe you become angry or get bitter or resentful, then those seeds are going to develop a harvest of consequences that you're going to regret. Hebrews 12:15 warns us to not let any root of bitterness spring up, because it causes trouble, and by it says, many are defiled. And so bitterness doesn't only defile me, it affects the people around me. It has consequences. And I will carry with me a heart attitude out of that bitterness into every relationship that I have with God, with the people I love, with others around me, and it will affect my perspective and the choices I make going forward. So that's just one thing, bitterness. Just one seed of bitterness can have devastating consequences in my life and damage those around me. But how different it could be if we make a better choice in the midst of our circumstances. You know, many of those that maybe we have no control over. You must decide how you're going to respond. What if you see your circumstances not as an excuse for reacting in a hurtful way, but as an explanation of just, this is what has happened. And as you struggle to deal with those painful feelings that come out of it, you choose to make good choices that honor God and other people. The result will be a harvest of good consequences, no matter what your circumstances. You control what you harvest by what you plant. And so instead of letting what's happened to you destroy your hope for a better tomorrow, you can turn your circumstances over to God and accept that a good harvest is going to come in, because God knew these circumstances were going to come into your life if you're looking to Him. And if you're looking to Him and reacting to how He wants, good consequences are likely to flow into good choices. These are the things God wants to teach us in the midst of our circumstances in life. Because God knew all your days, from before you were born until you take your last breath, so He knew what you were going to experience in life. So what if you trust Him with your circumstances, obey Him in the midst of them, and allow Him to turn your struggles even into something good? Decision by decision, you're writing the story of your life, and it will affect the other people around you. So when you're making these decisions of any magnitude, you owe it to yourself, and you owe it to your descendants to ask yourself, what story do I want my life to tell? What crop do I want to plant? What harvest do I want my life to yield? Well, it's sort of see how good consequences can flow into good choices no matter what your circumstances. Take the story of Joseph. Around 1850 BC, a teenager named Joseph found himself in a tough spot. Jacob, his father, loved Joseph more than all the other 11 brothers. That's because Joseph was born to Jacob at his old age, and he was the son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. So one day, this is after many years had passed, Jacob sends Joseph out to check on his brothers and to bring back a report. Joseph's brothers didn't really like it very well because, after all, he was Dad's favorite, and he had a special coat made for him, and he told these dreams that made them look like a bunch of servants. And so they weren't going to be too happy about younger brother, Jacob's favorite, coming to check on him. So when they see him coming, they decided they're going to get rid of this, in their minds, troublemaker once and for all. But later, rather than killing him, they sell him off as a slave to some traders, so they got some money out of it as well. They dip his many-colored coat in blood, and they tell Jacob that a wild animal must have gotten him. Well, Jacob's heart, as you can imagine, was broken, and his brothers have a secret that they're going to have to live with for the rest of their lives. Their lie made them liars for life. Not the kind of legacy that you want to have. How you treat the people in your life is going to become a permanent part of your story. Is it going to be a story that you love to tell, or one that you're ashamed to admit? Well, Joseph ends up on an auction block in Egypt, where he's bought by Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's palace guard. Joseph has a decision that he has to make. Is he going to run away and throw away everything he has into being the best slave he can be? Who wants to be a good slave? But Joseph commits himself to excellence as a slave. He makes a good choice in the midst of bad circumstances. And what does he get? Well, Genesis 39:6 says, so Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. For he said to himself, with Joseph in charge, I don't need to concern myself with anything except the food that I eat. Well, thanks to his decision to be all in, Joseph ends up running Potiphar's entire household. That's a story worth telling. He might have said, I was kidnapped and sold into slavery. I was a victim, but I decided not to live as a victim. I decided to trust God and do the best with what I had. Well, in spite of Joseph's due diligence, he finds himself in this no-win situation where he has to make another decision. The boss's wife notices that Joseph is well built. He's one handsome dude. And she keeps trying to invite him into her bed. It looks like he's going to lose either way, because either he runs away and gets caught and ends up who knows where, or he gives in to Mrs. Potiphar, gets caught, and perhaps loses his life. So Joseph's strategy was just avoid her. Well, that worked for a while. He even tells her, he says, "With me in charge, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the household. Everything he owns, he's entrusted into my care. No one is greater in this household than I am." If Joseph has one flaw, he tends to be a braggart. "My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. And so in light of your husband's confidence in me and God's mercy to me, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Well, one day, Potiphar's gone, and Joseph is in the household alone with Mrs. Potiphar. And she tries to grab him, he refuses, and she ends up accusing him of rape, and Joseph lands in prison. Now, this was quite a setback to everything that he's accomplished up to this point. In spite of this unfortunate turn of events, the writer assures us the Lord was with Joseph. So no matter what your circumstances are, God does not leave you. He's right in the midst of them with you. Now, this seems all wrong. I mean, but Joseph's story is not over yet. And regardless of what you're going through right now or at any point in time, your story isn't over yet either. It's still being written, just like Joseph's, one decision at a time. So what happens to Joseph in prison? Well, Joseph does what Joseph does. He goes the extra mile, and he catches the attention of the warden. The warden ends up turning pretty much the administrative details over to Joseph, and Joseph is the one pretty much running the place. This is the last place that Joseph wanted to be, in prison, but he's there for a long time. You know, there are some unwanted circumstances that you have to live with for a long time, perhaps even the rest of your life. What kind of decisions are you going to make when you're forced to live an unwanted life? It depends on the story you want to tell. So 8 years into his prison life, 2 new inmates show up one morning. The former baker and the candlestick maker. No, it wasn't the candlestick maker. It was the baker and the cupbearer of no less than Pharaoh himself. Not long after their incarceration, they both have a dream. They don't understand the dream, and Joseph sees their sad faces. He finds out their dreams, and lo and behold, God has given Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. And so he tells them what their dreams or their future means. And so he says, in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to restore the cupbearer to his position. And that's where Joseph asks for the cupbearer's help. He says, "But when all goes well, if you remember me and show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." So, you know, the cupbearer's heard about his dream. The baker gets all excited about sharing his dream. "This is what your dream means," says Joseph. "Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head, impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." That's probably when the baker said to himself, "I wish I had kept that dream to myself." Well, sure enough, that's what happened. The cupbearer gets his job back, and the baker loses his head. But the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph and what he had asked. You know, it's hard to choose a good story when it feels like you've been forgotten. When it feels like nothing we do matters. That's when we can get careless and stop caring and make bad decisions, which leads to regret. Regret never makes for a good story. But Joseph, on the other hand, keeps doing what Joseph does. He keeps doing his best. 2 more years creep by. Now Joseph has been in prison for a decade. He probably has resigned himself to the fact that having the favor of the warden is about the best that he can hope for. This is as good as it was going to get. But you know, with God, things can change rather suddenly. And that's what happened. Pharaoh had a dream. In fact, 2 disturbing dreams. Genesis 41:8 says, in the morning his mind was troubled. It's Pharaoh here talking. So he sent for the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Guess who finally spoke up? The cupbearer says, hey, I know this guy who's really good with dreams. And so Joseph gets ushered right into the throne room. Pharaoh wastes no time in telling his dreams to Joseph, and Joseph wastes no time in sharing what they mean. He says, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Well, to make a long interpretation short, Joseph told him there was going to be 7 years of a booming economy, followed by 7 years of the Great Egyptian Depression. He suggested they store up crops during the good years so they'd be prepared for the bad years, and they find a skilled overseer for the project. Genesis goes on and says, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials, so Pharaoh asked him, can we find anyone like this man right here, in whom is the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh looked at Joseph and said, you're the guy. With that, Joseph became the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, next to Pharaoh himself. He got a new title with his new responsibility, and Joseph did what Joseph always did. He did his best. So for the next 7 years, Joseph builds grain buildings. He stores up 7 years of surplus. Then the drought hits. The famine takes over, and it starts to settle in all across the region. Egypt was the only nation with all this grain, and so everybody is coming from around the various regions surrounding Egypt to get grain for their family, to be able to survive. It just so happened, no, it didn't just so happen, that Joseph's brothers come down to pick up grain, and he's in the grain building that they arrive at. They have no clue at all as to who he is. But right away, he knows who they are. And they bow down with their faces to the ground, like those teenage dreams that he had. Talk about a change in circumstances and the consequences of choices. What do you do now when you have the power and the decision that you make can determine your enemy's destiny? What do you decide to do in a moment like that? Well, it depends on what you've been growing in your life all along. It depends on the story that you want to tell. Joseph's response to his brothers is a reminder that unpleasant circumstances can often create unprecedented, eye-popping, decision-making opportunities. When you decide what everybody else expects you to decide, nobody thinks anything of it. But when you decide in ways that go against the norm of how we tend to react in our human nature, then your story can stand out. So instead of Joseph doing what most people would expect, exacting revenge, he reveals himself. This is what he says, Genesis 45:1. Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he said to them, I am Joseph. Now imagine that you're the 11 brothers. You're standing there, and this is, what's going through your mind? Things like, uh-oh, we're busted. What's going to happen to us now? In fact, verse 3 says they were terrified at his presence. They were scared to death. In fact, they probably thought, we're dead men. But Joseph had been deciding a good story for 13 years since he had last seen them. He wasn't about to ruin it with a revenge chapter.
His brothers didn't have to be terrified in his presence, because in his absence, through some difficult times, Joseph had lived as if God was present, which of course he was. He had committed to make good choices, and he gave his best when life seemed to be at its worst. Joseph not only rescued Egypt and the surrounding nations from famine, he rescued his family, and by the way, the history of Israel as well. He moved them all down to Egypt, and he saved their future. Good decision. A good story. It's when we decide against the grain and make good choices, no matter what, that we live a story worth telling. No matter what story you've been writing up till now, it's not too late to change the ending. There's a legend about the sheep counties of England, about two men who were arrested and convicted for stealing sheep. The magistrates decided to send them to prison for several years, and they decreed that the letter S should be inscribed on their foreheads with a hot iron. He wanted nobody to forget about what they had done. Well, after their jail sentence was over, one of them left the area. He was never heard from again. And then the other one, very sorry for what he had done, dedicated the rest of his life to God and chose to reach out and serve the community in which he had committed these crimes. As the years passed, everyone fell into his debt because of the ways he just freely gave himself to help them out in their sicknesses, their times of family crisis, and difficulties in life. Over time, no one remembered or spoke of his earlier crime of stealing. They only spoke of how he gave himself out of a heart of love for them. Well, one day, two boys were playing outside when they saw this now aged man walking by. And one of them asked the other, "What do you think that S on his forehead means?" "Well, I'm not sure," said the second one, "but from the way my mom talks about it, I think it must mean saint." You see, it's not too late to write a story of what your life is about, what you want to tell, what you want told about you, what's most important to you. You do that whether you realize it or not. Every day, one decision at a time. Decision 2 leads to fewer regrets. The legacy decision, and it's this. I'm going to decide to tell a story, to live a story that I'm proud to be told. I will not decide anything that makes me a liar for life. So every decision becomes a part of your story. What story do you want to tell? What do you want people talking about your life when you're gone? Let's pray together. Lord, I